force to defend myself or another. Won't necessarily do that, but I could if I wanted to. It's called Stand Your Ground, and it was passed about a year and a half ago. It replaces the Castle Doctrine, which dictates that if you can run from danger, that should be your first option. And there is now an effort underway in Concord to go back to that law. Joining me to talk about it, voices from both sides. We have Representative Steve Shurtleff, who is the sponsor of the bill, the repeal bill, and Jennifer Coffey, who is a former state rep and a gun rights advocate and the founder director of the Second Amendment Sisters.
I'm the National Director of Legislative Affairs.
All right, thank you. But Representative Shurtleff, let's start with you. Why do you think that we need to go back? This law's been on the books a year and a half, hasn't really caused any problems.
Well, your opening statement was, under the current law, if you're threatened at a public place or an innocent third party is threatened, you're justified in using deadly force. Under House Bill 135, which was our old self-defense law, the same is true. If you're in a public place and see you're threatened and somebody else, you're perfectly justified in using deadly force. The only part about retreat is if you're in a situation, let's say an argument in the bar, before it escalates into violence, you should get up and walk out. But if you're threatened or you know somebody else is being threatened, you're perfectly justified. There's no retreat.
Jennifer?
There's no reason to make the law-abiding citizen have to stop and think about whether or not they can retreat. How many people do we want to die while they're pondering whether or not they can retreat? There's been absolutely zero instances of any issues in regards to this law changing in the last 2 years. Nobody can point to one example. Can you point to one example?
No, and that's part of the reason I brought this law forward. For 3 years, New Hampshire's been ranked the safest state in the nation. In the New Hampshire legislature, we've always been proud of the fact that we're a proactive legislature. We've looked at the results of the American Bar Association study of what's happened in Florida under their Stand Your Ground law. 60% of those who use Stand Your Ground as a defense have a prior criminal record. A third of those have a record for crimes of violence. We've seen the justifiable homicides increase 8% in Texas. I want to see us do something here in New Hampshire, too, before we have a tragedy. And we found under our old law that it worked fine. We've heard a lot of rumors about, and myths about what Stand Your Ground does as opposed to House Bill 135. And it somewhat saddens me, the amount of false information that the NRA and other gun informations have put out there that have brought a lot of fear and confusion and concern to law-abiding citizens.
And it's an absolute red herring to be bringing other groups into it, or other states. It's a well-known fact that under New Hampshire law, and this never changed when we put in Stand Your Ground, that you have to be faced with imminent life-threatening danger, you have to be at risk of being raped or being robbed before you can use deadly force. Just because somebody looks at you and says they don't like you doesn't give you the right to use deadly force. That part of the law never changed. What we do have to look at is there is no definition of what it means to safely retreat. But what we do know for a fact is that the law-abiding citizen is going to have to stop and ponder that. How many people are going to die because of it?
But the fact is, neither one of these laws have really been applied. I mean, they've been on the books, Stand Your Ground for a year and a half, Castle Doctrine, long time before that. And there's no cases that people look at and say, see, that's why it's a flawed law in either case. But I do want to ask you about the 8% increase, according to the study out of Texas A&M, in Stand Your Ground states, and the 8% increase in homicides that this study revealed. How do you think that may or may not apply to New Hampshire?
It doesn't apply at all. Number one, it doesn't even include New Hampshire. This was done years ago. It's out of Texas. It's based out of different laws. Under New Hampshire law, you cannot use deadly force in the face of non-deadly force. That has always been the law. That is still the law. We didn't change that. No criminal is going to suddenly become a law-abiding citizen. Criminals don't follow the law. What we are doing is protecting law-abiding citizens. If we reverse this law, what we're doing is telling law-abiding citizens that they should stop and ponder whether or not they can get away. And you're a former law enforcement officer. How many times were you called to a scene that you knew there was a violent attack or a rape in progress, and you got there in enough time to stop it?
Well, being with the U.S. Marshals, we usually made arrests after the fact when warrants were issued. But getting back to the point at hand, we talk about what 135 will do, and it returns us to a law that was in effect in this state from 1970 to 2011. And we've heard this anecdotal information about certain things happening, but the fact of the matter is this law worked. The Attorney General's office has told us, and
how do we know that the Stand Your Ground law isn't working either?
Because we looked other states, this law may be different, but basically it comes out of the NRA ALEC model legislation, which expands the Castle Doctrine to any place you have a lawful right to be. The Castle Doctrine has been a long-held law in this state, and a belief, going back to the Middle Ages, that a person's home is their last place of retreat. That never changes. You're perfectly justified in using deadly force in your own home. But the fact that if you're in an incident and you're in a confrontation, if you can get up and walk away, you should.
But to Jennifer's point, I mean, you find yourself in a situation where you feel threatened. Rarely do you have the opportunity to think about, okay, do I have an avenue of escape here? I mean, if your life's threatened, generally things are happening pretty quick.
If your life's threatened, you're going to use deadly force, and that's a fact. You know, if you're in a situation when you can get up and walk away from somebody you're having an argument with. 2 months ago in Tampa, two men got into a heated argument in a pizza parlor. One guy, the man who actually started the verbal argument, took out a gun and shot the other man. And the police said, why? And he said, well, he was bigger than me. I thought he might get into a fist fight, and so I had to defend myself. And so on his stand your ground, I shot him. That's ridiculous. We had a perfectly good self-defense law, which was just that. Self-defense and defense of yourself or innocent third party.
We're running low on time. Jennifer, I want to give you one more.
And I want to point out, it's a red herring to keep bringing up the NRA and ALEC as model legislation. Every legislator, you're a member of the National Coalition for Legislative Affairs, and they make model legislation, and that's not dragged out or through the mud. This is about people being able to protect themselves. We're not in Florida. We're not in Texas. If I'm faced with imminent danger, I, as a law-abiding citizen, should not be forced to stop and ponder whether or not I can safely retreat. How many people are going to die before that actually occurs that we realize, oh, gee, maybe we shouldn't have done that? And the other thing is it keeps getting brought up about whether or not this law, it's been on the books for a long time. Well, the legislature celebrated freeing slaves recently, and for a long time, women didn't have the right to vote, but we certainly changed that. When a law should be changed, it should be changed.
All right, well, we're going to be getting a Senate Judiciary Committee recommendation on the repeal bill very shortly, and then a full vote in the Senate, where a lot of people believe it's a tough challenge there. But thank you very much for joining us on the show to talk about both sides of this.
Always a pleasure.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, we'll be right back with a few local